A black boy gave his only meal to a shabbily dressed man outside his school. 2 days later, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled up to his family's apartment building. When the back door opened, DeAndre Jackson couldn't believe his eyes. The homeless man he'd helped now stood before him in an immaculate suit, and his next words would change DeAndre's life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. DeAndre Jackson woke to the sound of plates clinking in the kitchen. Through the threadbare curtains of the two-bedroom apartment, early morning light painted shadows on the wall he shared with his little sister, Zara. He could hear his mother's muffled voice, probably on another call about their overdue rent. The springs creaked as he carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake Zara, who was still curled up in her twin bed across the room. Their shared space was small but neat. His mother, Letitia, had always taught them that being broke doesn't mean being broken. Still, DeAndre noticed how the paint was peeling near the window, and the carpet was worn thin from years of careful vacuuming. In the narrow kitchen, his mother stood with her back turned, her phone pressed between her ear and shoulder as she prepared breakfast. Her braids were already neatly done, ready for her shift at the diner, but DeAndre could see the tension in her shoulders. "Yes, Ms. Rodriguez, I understand. I'll have the rent by the end of the week, I promise." Letitia's voice carried that forced calm she used when things were really bad. "If you could just give us a little more time." DeAndre pretended not to hear as he reached for the last piece of bread in the bag. The peanut butter jar was nearly empty, and he scraped the sides carefully, making sure to leave enough for Zara's breakfast. His stomach growled as he spread the thin layer on his bread. It would have to last until dinner. "Morning, baby," Letitia said after ending the call, turning to face him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was pretty. Everyone said so. But lately the worry lines around her eyes had gotten deeper. "You sleep okay?" "Yeah, Mom." DeAndre tried to sound cheerful, like everything was fine. Like he hadn't heard her crying late last night when she thought they were asleep. "Are you working the double shift again today?" "Got to, baby. The bills won't pay themselves." She reached out to straighten his collar, her hands gentle despite their roughness from years of waitressing. "Uncle Ray might stop by later to check on you and Zara after school. I left some soup in the fridge for dinner." DeAndre nodded, carefully wrapping his meager lunch in a paper napkin. They couldn't afford plastic wrap anymore. He glanced at the stack of bills on the counter, the red final notice stamps visible even from where he stood. Ever since the hospital, bills from Zara's asthma attack last winter. They'd been falling behind on everything. The sound of small feet padding across the floor announced Zara's arrival. "DeAndre, you promised to braid my hair today." His 7-year-old sister bounded into the kitchen, her bright smile a stark contrast to the worn surroundings. "Come here, little lady," DeAndre said, pulling out a kitchen chair. He'd learned to braid hair from watching YouTube videos, wanting to help his mom, who often left for work before dawn. As his fingers worked through Zara's curls, he could hear his mother making calls, trying to pick up extra shifts at her second job cleaning offices. The walk to school would be long, they couldn't afford the bus fare anymore, but DeAndre didn't mind. It gave him time to think, to dream up ways he could help his family. At 12 years old, he already understood more about financial struggle than any kid should, but he was determined to keep his grades up. Education was his ticket out, his mother always said. As he headed out the door, lunch in hand, Letitia hugged him tight. "You're my man of the house, DeAndre. I'm so proud of you." DeAndre hugged her back, breathing in the familiar scent of cocoa butter and coffee. "We're gonna be okay, Mom, I promise." He stepped out into the morning air, adjusting his second-hand backpack on his shoulders. The neighborhood wasn't much to look at. Broken sidewalks, abandoned storefronts, and chain-link fences marking territory that had seen better days. But it was home, and DeAndre walked with his head high, his mother's words echoing in his mind. "It's not where you're from, it's where you're going." Little did he know, his journey was about to take an unexpected turn, all because of a choice he would make in the next few hours. A choice that would test his character and change not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The morning sun beat down on DeAndre's shoulders as he walked the familiar route to Jefferson Middle School. He'd memorized every crack in the sidewalk, every boarded-up storefront along Malcolm X Boulevard. The sound of his worn sneakers scuffing against the pavement echoed in the quiet morning air. His stomach growled, reminding him of the thin peanut butter sandwich in his bag. The hunger wasn't new. He'd learned to live with it, just like he'd learned to ignore the holes in his socks and the fraying edges of his school uniform. What really bothered him was knowing his mom was probably skipping meals again to make sure he and Zara had enough to eat. As he approached the school gates, he heard the rumble of Isaiah's skateboard before he saw him. His best friend rolled up beside him, expertly flipping his board under his arm. "Yo, DeAndre. You missed it yesterday." "They put up new basketball hoops at the community center," Isaiah said, falling into step beside him. "Want to check them out after school?" DeAndre shook his head, adjusting his backpack. "Can't. Got to get home to Zara. Mom's working late again." Isaiah's expression softened. He knew about DeAndre's situation. They'd been friends since kindergarten. "Your mom is still doing doubles at the diner?" "Yeah. And cleaning offices at night now, too." DeAndre's voice dropped lower as they entered the school building. "Ms. Rodriguez came by again yesterday, talking about eviction if we don't pay up by the end of the week." "Man, that's rough," Isaiah muttered, his usual playful demeanor turning serious. "How much do you guys need?" 3 months behind now, that's like... DeAndre did the quick math in his head. Almost $2,000. The number hung between them, impossibly large. They headed to their lockers, the hallway filled with the usual morning chaos of slamming metal doors and loud conversations about weekend plans. DeAndre tried not to notice how many of his classmates had new phones or designer backpacks. In the first period, Ms. Parker was teaching algebra, but DeAndre could barely focus. The numbers on the board blurred as he thought about the stack of bills at home, about his mother's tired eyes, about Zara's asthma medication that they were struggling to afford. He'd overheard his mom on the phone with Uncle Ray last night, pride cracking in her voice as she asked to borrow money again. "DeAndre?" Ms. Parker's voice cut through his thoughts. "Could you solve this equation for us?" He stood up, grateful he'd at least done his homework last night. Math was his best subject. Numbers made sense in a way that life sometimes didn't. As he worked through the problem on the board, he could hear whispers behind him about the upcoming school dance, about new video games, about weekend plans at the mall. It was like living in a parallel universe, one where kids didn't have to worry about whether the electricity would still be on when they got home. During lunch period, DeAndre sat with Isaiah in their usual spot under the big oak tree in the courtyard. He watched as other kids pulled out packed lunches or lined up to buy hot meals from the cafeteria. The smell of pizza and French fries made his stomach clench. "Here," Isaiah said, breaking his chocolate chip cookie in half and offering it to DeAndre. "My mom made extra." DeAndre hesitated, pride warring with hunger. "Nah, man, I'm good." "Come on, don't front," Isaiah insisted, placing the cookie half on DeAndre's knee. "You know my mom would kill me if she found out I didn't share." As they ate, they could hear some kids nearby talking about the latest iPhone release. DeAndre thought about his own phone, an old model handed down from Uncle Ray with a cracked screen and a battery that barely held a charge. But it was better than nothing. At least his mom could reach him if there was an emergency with Zara. "You know," Isaiah said carefully, "my dad might be able to help out with some work at his garage. Just on weekends, maybe?" DeAndre shook his head. Already asked Ms. Rodriguez about doing maintenance work in the building for credit on the rent. She said no. Something about liability issues. He crumpled his sandwich wrapper, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his stomach. Besides, Mom would never let me. She's big on me focusing on school, you know. The afternoon classes dragged by, each minute feeling like an hour. In science class, they were supposed to be learning about chemical reactions, but all DeAndre could think about was the reaction he'd seen on his mother's face this morning, the way her smile had crumbled when she thought he wasn't looking. As the final bell rang, DeAndre gathered his books slowly, knowing he had to face another long walk home. The weight of their situation pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any backpack. He was just a kid, but he felt the responsibility of a grown man, desperately wanting to help but not knowing how. Little did he know, fate was about to present him with a choice. One that would test not just his character, but everything his mother had taught him about kindness, dignity, and doing the right thing, even when times were tough. The afternoon heat shimmered off the pavement as DeAndre started his walk home. He'd chosen the longer route today, past the small businesses and shops that lined the main street. Sometimes Mr. Wilson at the corner store would give him day-old bread if he had any left, but today the closed sign hung in the window. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His path took him past a row of once proud brownstones, their stoops now crumbling, their windows reflecting the golden afternoon light. The neighborhood had seen better days, but there was still pride here, evident in the carefully tended window boxes, and the way elderly neighbors still swept their portions of the sidewalk clean every morning. As he approached the intersection near Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, something caught his eye. There, slumped against the wall of the old barber shop, sat a man DeAndre hadn't seen before. The man's clothes were worn and dirty, his gray beard unkempt, and his eyes seemed focused on something far away. But there was something different about him. Something in his posture, perhaps, or the way his hands lay quietly in his lap. DeAndre slowed his pace. He'd seen homeless people before. They weren't uncommon in this part of the city. But something about this man made him pause. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. Or maybe it was because, despite his shabby appearance, his face reminded DeAndre of the family photo of his grandfather he kept by his bed. His hand unconsciously went to his backpack, where his meager lunch still sat untouched. He'd been too worried about their situation to eat during the lunch period, saving it for later when the hunger became too much to bear. His stomach growled, reminding him that this sandwich was all he had until dinner, and even that would be small, stretching the soup his mother had left to feed both him and Zara. First period. I haven't eaten it yet. The man looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle. You're sure you don't need it yourself, young man? DeAndre swallowed hard. The truth was, he did need it. His stomach was already protesting, and he knew the hunger would make it hard to focus on his homework later. But something inside him, something stronger than hunger, made him nod. I'm sure, he said, carefully unwrapping the sandwich and holding it out. It's just peanut butter, but... He trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by how little he had to offer. The man's hands were weathered but clean as he accepted the sandwich. Thank you, he said simply, but his eyes held DeAndre's for a moment longer than necessary. What's your name, son? DeAndre Jackson, sir. A slight smile crossed the man's face. Thank you, DeAndre Jackson. Kindness like yours is rare these days. DeAndre shifted on his feet, unsure what to say. Finally, he managed a small smile. My mom always says we have to look out for each other, even when times are tough. The man nodded slowly, thoughtfully. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is, DeAndre agreed, thinking of how she managed to keep their family going despite everything. I should get home now. My sister's waiting. As he turned to leave, the man called after him. DeAndre? He looked back. You're a good young man. Don't forget that. The words followed DeAndre as he walked away, his stomach empty, but his heart somehow fuller. He thought about what his mother would say when he told her about this. Probably pull him into one of her tight hugs and tell him she was proud even while worrying about him going hungry. By the time he reached their apartment building, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Zara was waiting by the window, her face lighting up when she saw him. He managed to push aside his hunger as he helped her with her homework. heated up the soup for dinner, and made sure she took her asthma medication. Later that night, as he lay in bed listening to the city sounds outside his window, DeAndre thought about the man again. He hoped the sandwich had helped, even a little. His mother always said that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference. He didn't know it then, but his simple act of sharing would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything, not just for him and his family, but for their entire community. As he drifted off to sleep, the man's words echoed in his mind. Kindness like yours is rare these days. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, despite his empty stomach, DeAndre slept peacefully, knowing he'd done the right thing. 2 days had passed since DeAndre shared his lunch with the homeless man. The morning started like any other. The same worn curtains filtering the dawn light, the same quiet sounds of his mother getting ready for her early shift at the diner. But something was different about today. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made his skin prickle. Ms. Rodriguez had left another notice on their door last night. Final warning. The words were printed in bold red letters that seemed to shout from the paper. DeAndre had quickly crumpled it up before Zara could see it, but he couldn't erase the look of defeat he'd glimpsed on his mother's face. "DeAndre, baby," Letitia called from the kitchen, her voice strained despite her attempt at cheerfulness. "Don't forget your lunch." She'd managed to scrape together enough for a small sandwich today, though DeAndre knew she'd probably gone without breakfast herself to do it. He was halfway through getting Zara's hair done for school when they heard it, the unfamiliar sound of a powerful engine idling outside their building. In their neighborhood, most cars were at least a decade old, their engines coughing and sputtering. This sound was different, smooth, expensive, commanding attention. "What's that?" Zara pressed her face against the window, her half-finished braids forgotten. "DeAndre, look." Outside, gleaming in the morning sun, sat a sleek black Rolls-Royce. Its polished surface reflected the worn buildings around it like a mirror, making it seem even more out of place. A small crowd was already gathering on the sidewalk, neighbors pointing and whispering. "Get away from the window," Letitia said sharply, her protective instincts kicking in. But before they could move, the rear door of the luxury car swung open. DeAndre's breath caught in his throat. The man who stepped out was dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit that probably cost more than their entire year's rent. His shoes gleamed, his posture radiated confidence and power. But his face, DeAndre would never forget that face. "Mom," he whispered, That's the man I gave my sandwich to." Letitia moved closer to the window, her hand gripping DeAndre's shoulder. They watched as the man straightened his tie and looked directly up at their window, offering a small smile and a nod of recognition. "DeAndre Jackson," his voice carried clearly through the morning air. "Would you and your mother join me for a conversation?" The whispers from the gathered neighbors grew louder. Ms. Rodriguez emerged from her ground-floor apartment, her usual stern expression replaced by one of shocked curiosity. Isaiah, who had been walking to school, stood frozen on the sidewalk, his skateboard dangling forgotten from his hand. "Mom?" DeAndre looked up at his mother, seeing the mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. Letitia squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. "Zara, go finish getting ready for school, baby." She turned to DeAndre, her voice low. "Stay close to me." They made their way down the creaking stairs, past the peeling wallpaper and flickering hallway lights. Each step seemed to echo in the silence. When they pushed open the building's front door, the morning sunlight momentarily blinded them. The man, so different from the disheveled figure DeAndre had met 2 days ago, stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Jackson, I'm William Banks. Your son showed me extraordinary kindness the other day. I'd like to talk to you both about that, if I may." Letitia shook his hand, her confusion evident, but her dignity intact. "Mr. Banks, I'm not sure I understand. Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private?" He gestured toward the car where a uniformed driver stood at attention. "I promise to explain everything." DeAndre could feel everyone's eyes on them. Old Mrs. Johnson was watching from her first-floor window. The Rodriguez kids had stopped their game of hopscotch to stare. Even the usually indifferent teenagers on the corner were paying attention. "There's a coffee shop around the corner," Letitia suggested, her voice firm. DeAndre recognized that tone. It was the one she used when she wanted to stay in control of a situation. Mr. Banks smiled warmly. "Perfect. Please, lead the way." As they walked, DeAndre noticed how Mr. Banks took in their neighborhood, not with the usual pity or judgment they sometimes got from outsiders, but with thoughtful consideration. He moved with the confidence of someone used to power, yet there was something approachable about him, something that reminded DeAndre of the quiet dignity he'd seen in the man on the street. The bell above Joe's coffee shop door chimed as they entered. The morning regulars looked up, then did double takes at the sight of Mr. Banks in his expensive suit. Joe himself, who had known Letitia since before DeAndre was born, raised his eyebrows but quickly guided them to a quiet corner booth. As they settled into the cracked vinyl seats, DeAndre's mind raced with questions. Who was this man really? Why had he been disguised as homeless? And most importantly, what did he want with them? Mr. Banks folded his hands on the table, looking directly at DeAndre. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," he began, his voice carrying the same gentle tone from that day on the street. "The truth is, your act of kindness made quite an impression on me, DeAndre. More than you could know." The morning sun streamed through the coffee shop's dusty windows, casting long shadows across their table. In that moment, sitting across from this mysterious man who had somehow transformed from a street person to what was clearly a man of great wealth and power, DeAndre felt like he was in a dream. But his mother's steady presence beside him, her hand resting protectively near his shoulder, kept him grounded in reality. Little did they know, this conversation was about to change the course of their lives forever. The aroma of coffee filled Joe's coffee shop as Mr. Banks leaned back in the booth studying DeAndre and his mother. Joe himself brought over 3 cups of coffee and a hot chocolate for DeAndre, waving away Letitia's attempt to pay. "Mrs. Jackson," Mr. Banks began, adding cream to his coffee with deliberate movements, "I want to be completely transparent with you about who I am and why I'm here." He pulled out his phone, showing them a news article. The headline read, "Banks Technology CEO continues innovative community investment program." Letitia's eyes widened as she read. "You're that William Banks? The one who's been in the news for trying to find genuine ways to help communities that have been overlooked, yes." He put his phone away, his expression serious. "I've learned that throwing money at problems doesn't solve them. Real change requires finding people with real character." DeAndre listened intently as Mr. Banks continued. "For the past 6 months, I've been visiting different neighborhoods, disguising myself as a homeless person. I wanted to see who would show kindness without expecting anything in return." His eyes met DeAndre's. "Your son was the first person in 3 days to not only acknowledge me but to share his only food when he clearly needed it himself." Letitia's hand found DeAndre's under the table, squeezing it tight. "That's how I raised him," she said softly, pride evident in her voice despite her wariness. "And you've done a remarkable job, Mrs. Jackson," Mr. Banks replied. "Which is why I'm here with a proposal for both of you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've done my homework. DeAndre is a straight-A student in math and science. You're working 2 jobs to keep your family afloat. Your daughter Zara has asthma that requires expensive medication." DeAndre felt his mother stiffen beside him. "You've been investigating us?" "I needed to make sure my instincts about DeAndre were right," Mr. Banks said gently. "I don't make offers like this lightly." He opened the folder, spreading several documents on the table. "First, I want to establish a full educational trust for both DeAndre and Zara. This would cover their education through college, including any advanced degrees they might pursue." Letitia's breath caught audibly. DeAndre stared at the papers, his heart pounding. "Second," Mr. Banks continued, "I want to offer you a position at Banks Technology's Community Outreach Division, Mrs. Jackson. Full benefits, including," health insurance that would cover Zara's medical needs. The salary would be... He wrote a number on a napkin and slid it across the table. Letitia's hand trembled as she looked at the figure. This can't be real. It is, Mr. Banks assured her. But there's more. I've also arranged for you to receive management training. Your experience juggling multiple jobs while raising 2 children shows exactly the kind of organizational skills we need. He turned to DeAndre. And for you, young man, I want to enroll you in our STEM mentorship program. You'll work with some of the best minds in technology, starting with after-school sessions 3 times a week. If you're interested, of course. DeAndre's mind raced with possibilities. No more wondering if they'd have enough food. No more watching his mother come home exhausted from double shifts. No more worrying about Zara's medication. Why? The question burst from him before he could stop it. Why us? Mr. Banks smiled, but his eyes were serious. Because kindness matters, DeAndre. Because when you had every reason to walk past someone in need, you stopped. You shared what little you had without expecting anything in return. That kind of character is rare, and it deserves to be nurtured. He turned to Letitia. And because you, Mrs. Jackson, have raised 2 children with strong values despite incredibly difficult circumstances, that's exactly the kind of leadership we need in our community programs. Letitia sat straight in her seat, her dignity evident despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. This is overwhelming. We need time to think about it. Of course, Mr. Banks nodded, gathering the papers back into the folder. Take all the time you need to review everything. My lawyers can explain any details you want to clarify. He pulled out a business card and placed it on top of the folder. But there is one thing that can't wait. He reached into his briefcase again and withdrew another envelope. I understand you're having some issues with your landlady, Ms. Rodriguez. This should take care of any outstanding rent and secure your lease for the next year, giving you time to decide your next steps without that pressure. Letitia's hand flew to her mouth, tears finally spilling over. DeAndre felt his own eyes burning as he watched his mother, his strong, proud mother, who had carried their family through so much, finally allow herself to accept help. Mr. Banks stood, straightening his suit jacket. Take a few days to think everything over. My driver will be available if you need transportation to our offices to discuss details. He paused, looking at DeAndre. You know, when I was your age, someone gave me a chance that changed my life. I've never forgotten that feeling. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you. As they watched him leave the coffee shop and slide into his waiting car, DeAndre and his mother sat in stunned silence. The folder on the table seemed to pulse with possibility, with hope, with a future they'd only dreamed about. Joe appeared with fresh coffee and a plate of pastries on the house, giving Letitia's shoulder a gentle squeeze as he passed. Outside, they could hear the neighborhood buzzing with excitement about the mysterious visitor in the Rolls-Royce. Mom? DeAndre finally broke the silence. Is this really happening? Letitia pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Baby, I think your kindness just opened a door we didn't even know existed. Through the coffee shop window, they watched the Rolls-Royce disappear around the corner, leaving their world forever changed by a simple act of sharing a sandwich with a stranger. The next morning arrived with a strange mix of hope and anxiety. DeAndre sat at their small kitchen table, staring at Mr. Banks's business card while his mother made phone calls in the other room. The folder full of life-changing opportunities lay open before him, its contents still seeming more like a dream than reality. The news had spread through their building like wildfire. Ms. Rodriguez had already stopped by twice, her usual stern demeanor replaced by an almost uncomfortable friendliness. DeAndre could hear neighbors in the hallway, their whispered conversations about the mysterious black car and its wealthy occupant drifting through the thin walls. I just don't understand, he overheard one neighbor say. Why them? What makes them so special? The word stung more than DeAndre expected, At school, the atmosphere had shifted too. Word had gotten out. It always did in their neighborhood, and suddenly, everyone wanted to be his friend. Kids who had never given him a second glance were inviting him to sit with them at lunch. Even some teachers were looking at him differently. Only Isaiah remained unchanged, skateboarding up to him as usual that morning. "Man, this is wild," he said, falling into step beside DeAndre. "My mom said she saw the whole thing. Said dude's car cost more than our whole block." "Yeah," DeAndre replied, uncomfortable with the attention. "It's different." As they walked to class, he could feel the stares, hear the whispers. A group of 8th graders who usually ruled the hallways watched him pass, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, something that made DeAndre's stomach twist. In math class, Ms. Parker called on him more than usual, her smile a little too bright. "DeAndre, why don't you share your solution with the class?" she asked repeatedly, as if his answers somehow carried more weight now. By lunchtime, the pressure was building. A group of popular kids waved him over to their table, something that had never happened before. "Yo, DeAndre," one called out. "Heard you're gonna be rich now. Don't forget about us when you're living in that mansion." DeAndre clutched his lunch bag, still containing the same modest sandwich, and headed for his usual spot with Isaiah instead. But even there, he couldn't escape the change. Some kids who used to bully him now tried to act like they'd always been friends. "Don't let it get to you," Isaiah said, noticing his discomfort. "They're just jealous." But it wasn't that simple. When DeAndre got home that afternoon, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face troubled. "Baby, we need to talk," she said, gesturing for him to sit down. "What's wrong, Mom? Did something happen with Mr. Banks's offer?" Letitia shook her head. "No, it's not that. Uncle Ray called. He's concerned." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some people in the neighborhood are talking, saying we must have done something wrong to get this kind of attention, saying it's not right that we're getting this opportunity when other families are struggling too." DeAndre's heart sank. Uncle Ray had always been their biggest supporter. "But we didn't do anything wrong," he protested. "I just helped someone. I didn't know who he was." "I know, baby." Letitia reached across the table, taking his hand. "But change. Change is complicated. Sometimes when good things happen to people, others have a hard time accepting it." Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Ms. Rodriguez, her usual scowl replaced by a syrupy smile. "Mrs. Jackson," she said, peering past Letitia into their apartment. "I was thinking, since your situation has improved, perhaps we should discuss adjusting your rent to better reflect current market values." Letitia's spine stiffened. "Our lease is fixed for next year, Ms. Rodriguez. Mr. Banks's lawyer was very clear about that." The landlady's smile tightened. Of course, but you understand, with such prominent connections now, certain adjustments might be expected." After she left, DeAndre could see the worry lines returning to his mother's face. "See what I mean?" she said softly. "Everyone wants a piece of something they think we've got." That evening, as DeAndre helped Zara with her homework, he overheard more neighbors in the hallway. "Bet they think they're better than us now," someone said. "Watch them move to some fancy neighborhood first chance they get." The words hurt because they couldn't be further from the truth. This was their home, their community. The opportunity Mr. Banks offered wasn't about leaving, right? It was about building a better life right where they were. Later that night, as DeAndre lay in bed, he heard his mother on the phone with Mr. Banks's office. "Yes, I understand the position comes with additional responsibilities," she was saying, her voice tight with stress. "But I need to make sure this won't put my children at risk. People are already." He pulled his pillow over his head, trying to block out the reality that was creeping in. The fairy tale of the mysterious benefactor was giving way to something more complicated. Their lives were changing, yes, but change, as his mother said, was never simple. Just before he fell asleep, his phone buzzed with a text from Isaiah. Hey man, don't sweat the haters. Real ones know who you are. DeAndre stared at the message, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. The opportunity Mr. Banks offered was amazing, life-changing even. But now he was beginning to understand that it came with its own set of challenges that would test not just him, but his entire family's strength and character in ways they never expected. The next few days brought a whirlwind of changes. Mr. Banks's driver, a quiet man named James, had become a regular sight outside Jefferson Middle School, waiting to take DeAndre to the new STEM program. The sleek black car drew stares every time, making DeAndre wish he could just walk like before. The community center where the program was held sat in a different neighborhood, its modern glass facade a stark contrast to the familiar brick buildings of his own community. Inside, DeAndre found himself surrounded by kids from all over the city, many from privileged backgrounds he'd only seen on TV. "Today we'll be working on robotics," Dr. Thompson announced, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. The teacher was different from what DeAndre had expected, stern but encouraging, pushing them to think beyond their comfort zones. "Partner up, everyone." DeAndre looked around the room, feeling the familiar twist in his stomach. Most of the other kids already knew each other, their easy laughter and inside jokes creating invisible barriers. A few glanced his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, something that reminded him too much of the looks he got at school now. "Hey," a voice said beside him. "Want to work together?" It was a girl named Sophie, her expensive clothes and confident smile marking her as someone from a very different world than his. They started working on their robot, and DeAndre found himself relaxing slightly as they focused on the task. Numbers and mechanics made sense in a way that people sometimes didn't. But then Sophie asked the question he'd been dreading. "So, is it true? About how you got into the program?" Her voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp with curiosity. "My dad says Mr. Banks never just gives opportunities like this. You must have done something really special." Before DeAndre could respond, another student chimed in. "I heard he was living on the streets or something. That's why Banks picked him. It's like a charity case." The words hit like a physical blow. DeAndre's hands stilled on the robot parts, his face burning. "That's not—" "It wasn't like that," he managed to say. But the damage was done. The whispers had followed him here too. At home, things weren't much better. Ms. Rodriguez had started random inspections of their apartment, citing concerns about maintaining property values. Each visit felt like an invasion, her eyes lingering on every detail as if searching for reasons to find fault. "Baby, don't let it get to you," Letitia said after one such visit, but DeAndre could see the strain in her face. She had started her training at Banks Technology, coming home each evening exhausted but determined. "We're doing this for a better future." The pressure was building at school too. His grades had always been good, but now every test felt like a performance. Teachers who had barely noticed him before suddenly had high expectations. Even Ms. Parker, who had always been kind, now watched him like he was some kind of experiment in social mobility. "You're representing something bigger now," Dr. Thompson had told him after class one day at the STEM program. "Mr. Banks sees potential in you. Don't waste this opportunity." The words echoed in DeAndre's head as he sat in the back of Mr. Banks's car, watching his neighborhood scroll past the tinted windows. James, the driver, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, Mr. Jackson?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Just DeAndre," he corrected automatically. "And I don't know. Everything's different now. People look at me like you don't belong," James finished. "Like they're waiting for you to fail?" DeAndre looked up, surprised. James smiled knowingly in the mirror. "Mr. Banks helped me too, once upon a time. Paid for my college when my family couldn't. People said the same things then, that I was just a charity case, that I didn't deserve it." "How did you deal with it?" DeAndre asked quietly. "By proving them wrong. Not for them, for myself, and for the next kid who needs to see it's possible." When they pulled up to his building, DeAndre saw a group of local kids playing basketball. They used to invite him to play sometimes, but now they just watched as he stepped out of the car, their expressions unreadable. Inside, he found Zara sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side. "Some girls at school," she sniffled. "They said we think we're too good for everyone now, that we're going to leave and forget about them like everyone else who gets money." DeAndre pulled his sister into a hug, feeling her small body shake with sobs. This was the part that hurt the most, watching how the changes affected her, how the community's reaction touched even his 7-year-old sister. Later that night, he overheard his mother on the phone with Mr. Banks. "I appreciate everything you're doing," she was saying, her voice tired but firm. "But I need to know, how do we handle this? The pressure, the jealousy, the way people are treating my children." DeAndre couldn't hear Mr. Banks's response, but his mother's next word stayed with him. "We're not looking for an escape. This is our home. We want to lift as we climb, but some people seem determined to pull us back down." As he lay in bed that night, DeAndre stared at the ceiling, thinking about James's words, about his mother's strength, about Zara's tears. The opportunity Mr. Banks had given them was amazing, but it had also placed them in a difficult position, caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. He pulled out his phone, looking at the robotics project specs for tomorrow's class. Maybe James was right. Maybe the only way forward was to prove himself, not for the doubters or the whispers, but for himself, for his family, and for every kid who needed to see that opportunities didn't have to mean leaving your community behind. A week later, DeAndre sat in Mr. Banks's office at Banks Technology headquarters, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The view from the 40th floor was breathtaking, the entire city spread out below like a living map. His mother sat beside him, her work badge from her new position at Banks Technology gleaming against her crisp blazer. "I hear there have been some challenges," Mr. Banks said, his expression concerned as he studied them both. The office was elegant, but not ostentatious, with photos of community projects lining the walls. "Dr. Thompson tells me you're excelling in the program, DeAndre, but that there have been social difficulties." DeAndre took a deep breath, remembering James's words about proving himself. "Is not just about me," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "Everyone back home, they think this is about leaving them behind. But that's not what I want." Mr. Banks leaned forward, his interest evident. "What do you want, DeAndre?" "I want to show them it's possible to succeed without forgetting where you came from. That opportunities don't have to mean abandoning your community." The words tumbled out, passionate and urgent. "A STEM program is amazing, but why can't we have something like that in our neighborhood? Why can't we bring these opportunities to more kids?" Letitia reached over, squeezing his hand, pride shining in her eyes. Mr. Banks sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What would you propose?" DeAndre straightened in his chair. "We have that empty community center on Malcolm X Boulevard. What if we turned it into a technology hub? Not just for a few kids, but for everyone. We could have after-school programs, adult education classes." He paused, then added, "My Uncle Ray's really good with computers. He could help teach, and there are other people in the neighborhood with skills to share." "Go on," Mr. Banks encouraged. Maybe that's what this was really about. Not just helping one family, but showing how one act of kindness can spread, how opportunities can multiply. Mr. Banks stood, walking to the window. "You know, DeAndre, when I was testing communities, I wasn't just looking for kind people. I was looking for leaders, people who could see beyond their own circumstances to the bigger picture." He turned back to them. "What you're proposing would require a lot of work. You'd have to help organize it, drum up community support, and prove it's sustainable." "I can do it," DeAndre said firmly. "We can do it. As a family. As a community." Later that afternoon, DeAndre stood before the assembled residents in their apartment building's common room. Ms. Rodriguez had reluctantly agreed to let them use the space, though she hovered near the door with her arms crossed. "I know things have been different lately," DeAndre began, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Some of you think we've changed, that we're trying to leave this community behind, but that's not true." He explained the plan for the Community Technology Center, watching faces shift from skepticism to interest. Uncle Ray stepped forward, offering to help with teaching. Mrs. Johnson from the first floor suggested using part of the space for senior computer literacy classes. "This isn't about one family getting lucky," DeAndre continued. "It's about showing what's possible when we work together. Mr. Banks is willing to invest in our community, but he needs to know we're invested too." Isaiah, who had been standing quietly in the corner, spoke up. "I'm in. My little cousins could use a place like that, better than hanging on the street corners." One by one, neighbors began to raise their hands, offering skills, time, and suggestions. Even Ms. Rodriguez uncrossed her arms, grudgingly offering to help with the paperwork for permits. That evening, as word spread through the neighborhood, DeAndre sat with his mother and Zara on their small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You did good today, baby," Letitia said softly. "Real good." Zara looked up from her homework. "Some of the kids at school asked if they could come to the technology center when it opens, even the ones who were mean before." DeAndre smiled, pulling his sister close. "That's the whole point, Z. This isn't about getting ahead. It's about bringing everyone along with us." His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Thompson. "Heard about your presentation to the community. This is exactly why you were chosen for the program. Keep leading by example." The next day at school, things felt different. When DeAndre walked the halls, the whispers had a new tone. Kids who had been avoiding him came up to ask about the technology center. Teachers offered to volunteer their time for tutoring programs. During lunch, Isaiah slid into his usual seat, grinning. "Man, you really did it. You found a way to make it work for everybody." DeAndre looked around the cafeteria, seeing not division, but possibility. "We did it," he corrected. "And we're just getting started." As he walked home that afternoon, he passed the spot where he'd first met Mr. Banks. The simple act of sharing a sandwich had sparked something bigger than himself. Not just an opportunity for one family, but a chance to show that real change comes from lifting others as you climb. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Lift as we climb." Finally, he understood exactly what that meant. The transformation of the old community center on Malcolm X Boulevard began on a bright Saturday morning. DeAndre arrived early with his mother and Zara to find a crowd already gathering. Mr. Banks had sent a team of contractors, but it was the neighborhood volunteers that made his heart swell with pride. Isaiah was there with his skateboard propped against the wall, helping his father unload boxes of donated computer equipment from their truck. Uncle Ray had set up a folding table, already deep in discussion with a Banks technology engineer about the best layout for the computer lab. "Look at this," Letitia said softly, watching as neighbors who had been skeptical just weeks ago now worked side by side, clearing debris and painting walls. "This is what a community looks like." Ms. Rodriguez arrived wearing old jeans instead of her usual formal attire, carrying a box of cleaning supplies. "Well," she said, catching DeAndre's surprised look, "if we're doing this, we're doing it right." Her usual stern expression softened slightly. "You know, my father used to run a business in this building, before the neighborhood changed. Maybe it's time for something new to grow here." Inside, the space was coming alive. Banks Technology had provided state-of-the-art computers and equipment, but it was the personal touches that made it special. Local artists had volunteered to paint murals celebrating the neighborhood's history and future. Someone had hung a banner across the entrance. "Technology and community, growing together." Dr. Thompson arrived mid-morning, rolling up his sleeves to help. "This is extraordinary, DeAndre," he said, surveying the scene. "You've done more than just start a program. You've started a movement." As they worked, DeAndre moved between groups, connecting people, solving problems, bringing his vision to life. He watched as Sophie, who had once dismissed him as a charity case, worked alongside kids from his neighborhood, learning as much as she was teaching. "You know," she said during a break, "I used to think success meant leaving places like this behind. But this is different. This is a real change." By late afternoon, the main computer lab was taking shape. Uncle Ray had gathered a group of teenagers, showing them how to set up the networking equipment. "These kids are naturals," he told DeAndre proudly. "Some of them already know more about coding than I do." Mr. Banks arrived without fanfare, dressed casually, and immediately joined in the work. DeAndre found him helping Zara and some other young kids set up a reading corner in what would become the children's learning area. "This exceeded all my expectations," Mr. Banks said quietly when DeAndre approached. "Do you know why?" When DeAndre shook his head, he continued, "Because you didn't just accept an opportunity, you multiplied it." That's true leadership. As the sun began to set, someone ordered pizza for everyone. The volunteers gathered in what would soon be the main classroom, sharing food and stories. DeAndre watched as barriers that had existed for years seemed to dissolve. Ms. Rodriguez was laughing with Mrs. Johnson about old neighborhood stories. Isaiah's father was teaching some of the bank's technology engineers about classic car restoration. "You see what you've started?" his mother asked, appearing beside him. She looked tired but happy, her new confidence evident in her posture. This is how real change happens, not from the top down, but from within. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, DeAndre sat at one of the new computer stations, looking at his reflection in the dark screen. He thought about the boy who had shared his sandwich just weeks ago, how far they'd come, how far they still had to go. James, who had been helping all day, paused on his way out. "Remember what I told you about proving them wrong?" he said with a smile. "Well, you did better than that. You proved something right, that one person's success can open doors for others." The next week, as final preparations were made for the center's opening, DeAndre received an email from Mr. Banks. The subject line read, "Phase 2? Inside was a proposal to expand the program to other neighborhoods, using their center as a model. Your community showing what's possible," Mr. Banks had written. "Are you ready to help others do the same?" DeAndre looked around the center, now humming with activity. Zara was attending a coding class for kids, her face bright with concentration. His mother was in the adult education room, helping other parents learn computer skills for better job opportunities. Through the window, he could see new faces arriving, drawn by the promise of opportunity. The center had become more than just a building with computers. It was proof that success didn't mean leaving your community behind. It meant bringing your community with you. Every person who walked through those doors carried the possibility of another story like his, another chance to prove that kindness and opportunity could multiply. As he typed his response to Mr. Banks, DeAndre smiled, remembering the simple act that had started it all. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest choices, and a single act of kindness could ripple out in ways you never expected. "Ready when you are," he wrote back. "Let's show other neighborhoods what's possible when we lift as we climb." 3 months after the Community Technology Center opened its doors, DeAndre stood before a crowded room at Banks Technology headquarters. Behind him, a slideshow displayed photos and statistics from the center's first quarter in operation. His mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride, while Mr. Banks watched thoughtfully from his seat among the board members. "In just 12 weeks, DeAndre began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "we've had over 300 people from our community participate in programs at the center." He clicked to the next slide. 52 adults have completed basic computer certification courses. 38 high school students have started learning coding, and our elementary school program is at full capacity with a waiting list. The numbers were impressive, but it was the stories behind them that really mattered. DeAndre thought about Mr. Johnson, who at 65 had learned to use a computer for the first time and was now video chatting with his grandchildren daily. About Maria from his building, who had landed a data entry job after completing the typing course. About the kids who now had somewhere to go after school besides the streets. But the real transformation, he continued, isn't in the numbers. It's in the way our community has come together. He shared how Ms. Rodriguez had started teaching Spanish computer literacy classes on weekends, how Uncle Ray had discovered a talent for teaching and was now pursuing a teaching certification, how Isaiah had started a skateboarding video editing club that was drawing kids from all over the neighborhood. After the presentation, Mr. Banks pulled DeAndre aside. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You've shown that when given the right tools and support, communities can transform themselves from within." The drive home with James was quiet but comfortable. They passed the spot where DeAndre had first met Mr. Banks, now marked by a small community garden that center volunteers had started. "You know," James said, glancing in the rearview mirror, "when I first started driving you, you could barely look people in the eye. Now look at you, presenting to corporate boards, running programs, making real change. At home, the transformation was evident too. Their apartment was still modest, but it felt different. The stack of unpaid bills was gone. Zara's asthma medication sat readily available on the kitchen counter. His mother's face had lost the constant worry lines that had aged her beyond her years. Letitia was thriving in her new role at Banks Technology. She'd recently been promoted to lead the community outreach division, bringing her natural leadership skills and deep understanding of the community to the position. More importantly, she was home for dinner most nights, no longer working endless double shifts just to keep them afloat. That evening, as they sat around their kitchen table, now clear of past due notices and decorated with Zara's latest computer art projects, DeAndre realized how much had changed within himself too. The fear and uncertainty that had been his constant companions had been replaced by something else. Purpose. "Mom," he said, helping her clear the dishes, "do you ever think about that day? When I gave away my sandwich?" Letitia paused, considering. "Every day, baby. But you know what? You didn't just give away a sandwich. You showed that kind of courage that changes lives. Not just ours, but now the whole community's." Later that night, DeAndre worked on his homework at one of the center's computers. The building stayed open late now, staffed by volunteer tutors and filled with people eager to learn. He watched as Ms. Rodriguez helped an elderly neighbor navigate email, her once harsh demeanor softened by the joy of teaching. Isaiah rolled in on his skateboard, now allowed inside since he'd started teaching younger kids video editing. "Yo, you see the new equipment Mr. Banks approved for the media lab?" he asked, excitement in his voice. "We're going to be able to start that podcast series we talked about." The center had become more than just a place for learning technology. It was a hub for dreams, a space where people could reimagine their futures. Kids who once thought their only options were limited by their zip code were now talking about college, careers in technology, ways to build businesses in their own community. Dr. Thompson, who now splits his time between the main STEM program and their center, often said that success wasn't just about individual achievement, it was about creating pathways for others to follow. DeAndre understood that now in a way he hadn't before. As he walked home that evening, the streets felt different. Where he once saw only crumbling buildings and dead ends, he now saw possibility. The neighborhood was changing, not through gentrification or displacement, but through empowerment and opportunity. Mr. Banks had taught him that true transformation wasn't about escaping your circumstances. It was about transforming them, about taking what you'd been given and using it to light the way for others. Reaching their apartment, DeAndre found Zara working on her coding project, her face scrunched in concentration. She looked up as he entered. "DeAndre, I figured out how to make the game work. Can I show it at the center's youth showcase next week?" He smiled, remembering how scared and uncertain she'd been just months ago. Now she was thriving, her natural creativity finding new outlets through technology. Of course, Z, you're going to knock their socks off. The transformation wasn't just in the big things, the new computers, the programs, the opportunities. It was in the small moments, too. The confidence in Zara's voice, the hope in his mother's smile, the pride in their neighbors' eyes when they talked about their center. DeAndre sat down at their small kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began working on plans for the center's expansion. The future wasn't just something that happened to you, he had learned. It was something you built, one act of kindness at a time. 6 months after that fateful day with the sandwich, DeAndre stood at the podium in the newly expanded community center. The room was packed. Community members, Bank's technology executives, local politicians, and most importantly, families from neighboring communities who wanted to learn about starting their own technology centers. When Mr. Banks first gave me an opportunity, DeAndre began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. I thought it was about changing my life, but it was really about showing us how to change our own community. He gestured to the screens behind him, displaying images of the center's success stories. Every person in this room has the power to create change. Sometimes it just takes one person to show what's possible. In the audience, he could see his mother sitting with Mr. Banks. Letitia was now heading the expansion program for community technology centers across the city. Her story, from waitress to community development executive, had become an inspiration for other single parents in the neighborhood. Zara sat beside them, tablet in hand, proudly showing off the educational game she'd developed with help from the center's coding program. At just 7 years old, she'd already become one of the center's youngest instructors, helping other kids learn basic programming concepts. We're not just teaching technology, DeAndre continued. We're building bridges between neighborhoods, between generations, between where we are and where we want to be. He shared how the center had partnered with local businesses to create internship programs, how they'd started a microloan program for community members wanting to start tech-based businesses, how their senior citizens computer literacy program had become a model for other communities. After the presentation, as people mingled and networked, DeAndre found himself surrounded by kids from other neighborhoods, all eager to know how they could start similar programs in their communities. The best part is, he told them, you don't have to wait for someone to choose you. You can start making changes right where you are. Ms. Rodriguez, who had become one of the center's strongest advocates, was leading a tour group through the facilities. 6 months ago, he heard her telling them, this was just an empty building. Now look at it. Look at what these kids have created. The center had indeed transformed. The once empty rooms now buzzed with activity. The computer lab was full of people of all ages, learning and teaching. The media room, where Isaiah ran his video editing classes, had become a creative hub for young content creators. Uncle Ray, now a certified technology instructor, was demonstrating new equipment to a group of interested parents. Technology isn't just for the young, he was saying. It's for anyone who wants to learn, to grow, to create opportunities. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Mr. Banks pulled DeAndre aside. You've exceeded every expectation, he said. But more importantly, you've shown others how to do the same. That's real leadership. They walked through the center together, passing the wall of success stories, photos and testimonials from community members whose lives had been changed. There was Mrs. Johnson, who now ran an online craft business. Mr. Martinez, who had learned enough coding to land a remote work position. Teenagers who had discovered passions for graphic design, web development, and digital storytelling. You know what the best part is? DeAndre said, stopping at the children's learning area where he'd first proposed the center. Every kid who walks through these doors knows they can dream bigger now. They don't have to choose between success and community. That night, as DeAndre helped close up the center, he found Isaiah in the media lab, editing footage for their community documentary project. Remember when we thought the biggest thing that could happen was getting out of the neighborhood? Isaiah asked, not looking up from his screen. Now we're building something worth staying for. At home, DeAndre found his mother at the kitchen table, working on expansion plans for the next center. The worry lines that had once seemed permanently etched on her face had been replaced by smile lines. Zara was asleep on the couch, her tablet displaying the code for her latest project. "You know," Letitia said, looking up from her work, "when you gave away that sandwich, you were just being the person I raised you to be. But look at what that one act of kindness started." DeAndre sat down beside her, looking at the plans spread across the table. Other communities were reaching out now, wanting to know how they could replicate their success. The ripple effect of that one morning was still spreading, touching more lives than he could have imagined. "We're just getting started, aren't we?" he asked. Letitia smiled, pulling him close. "Baby, this is just the beginning. You've helped show people that change is possible, that kindness multiplies, that success doesn't have to mean leaving your community behind." Through the window, DeAndre could see the lights of the center still glowing in the evening darkness, a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference. But now they faced them not alone but as a community, stronger together than they ever could have been apart. The future stretched out before them, bright with possibility, rich with purpose. And it had all started with a simple choice, a single act of kindness that had grown into something bigger than himself. Something that would continue to grow, to inspire, to transform. One person, one family, one community at a time. 1 year to the day after DeAndre had shared his sandwich with Mr. Banks, he sat on the steps of the community center, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, but soon it would be bustling with activity. A familiar black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb. Mr. Banks stepped out, dressed casually today, and joined DeAndre on the steps. "Do you know why I really chose this spot that day?" Mr. Banks asked, looking out at the neighborhood. "I'd been to dozens of communities, testing people's kindness, but there was something special about this place, something in the way people carried themselves despite their struggles." DeAndre nodded, understanding now what Mr. Banks had seen. "It wasn't just about being kind," he said. "It was about what we could become if someone believed in us." Inside the center, the morning light streamed through windows that now bore the names of successful community members, each one a testament to what was possible. Ms. Rodriguez was already there, preparing for her morning computer literacy class. She'd recently been promoted to Center Operations Director, her transformation from stern landlady to community leader complete. "You know what's remarkable?" Mr. Banks continued. "It's not just about the technology or the programs. It's about how one act of kindness sparked a chain reaction. Look around you." DeAndre did. He saw Isaiah arriving early to set up for his now famous video production workshop. His YouTube channel, started at the center, was inspiring kids across the city to tell their community's stories. Uncle Ray was pulling into the parking lot ready to teach his coding class, the same class that had already launched several local tech startups. His mother arrived next, carrying coffee for the morning staff meeting. Letitia Jackson, once struggling to make ends meet, was now a respected figure in community development. She'd just been featured in the city newspaper as a pioneer in urban technology education. "Sometimes," Letitia had told the reporter, "all it takes is one person willing to share what they have, even when they think they have nothing to give." Zara bounded up the steps, her backpack full of new coding projects. She'd recently won a citywide technology competition, but more importantly, she'd started teaching other young girls how to code. The next generation of leaders, Mr. Banks called them. Standing up, DeAndre looked at the center's new sign. The Jackson Banks Community Technology Hub, where kindness meets opportunity. Below it, in smaller letters, was the motto he'd chosen. "Lift as we climb." "You know what I've learned?" DeAndre said, turning to Mr. Banks. "Success isn't about getting out. It's about reaching back. Every person who walks through these doors has the potential to change someone else's life." Mr. Banks smiled, placing a hand on DeAndre's shoulder. "And that, DeAndre, is why a sandwich wasn't just a sandwich. It was proof that even the smallest act of kindness can transform lives in ways we never imagine. Inside, the center was coming alive. Community members of all ages were arriving, each carrying their own dreams, their own potential. The computer lab hummed with activity, the media room echoed with creativity, and the classrooms filled with learners of all ages. A new group of students gathered around DeAndre, eager to hear his story again, but he told them something different this time. "People always ask me about the day I shared my lunch with a billionaire," he said, looking at their eager faces. "But that's not really what changed our community. What changed us was realizing that every one of us has something to give, something to teach, something to share." He watched as his words sank in, seeing the same hope in their eyes that he'd discovered in himself a year ago. "So the real question isn't about what you'd do if you met a billionaire in disguise," he continued. "It's about what you're willing to share today, right now, with the people around you. Because you never know. Your small act of kindness might just start a revolution of its own." As the morning sun rose fully over their transformed neighborhood, DeAndre looked out at the community he'd once dreamed of escaping. Now it was a place people came to learn from, to be inspired by. A place where kindness had multiplied into opportunity, where one boy's choice had sparked a movement. And somewhere out there, he knew, another kid was about to make their own choice, to share what little they had, to believe in something bigger than themselves, to start their own chain reaction of kindness and hope. Because that's how real change happens. Not in grand gestures or magical transformations, but in the simple, brave choice to share what you have, even when you think you have nothing to give. That's how a sandwich became a revolution. That's how kindness changed a community. That's how hope found its way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.